I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends, three good friends, three great friends in the world of poetry to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of some poems. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for some poetry that interests us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA, at the Kelly Writer's House in our Wexler studio by Herman Beavers, poet, scholar, teacher, who has been my colleague here at the University of Pennsylvania since, Herm, 1989?
Correct.
That's a long time, among whose critical essays are those on August Wilson, Charles Johnson, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, whose most recent book is Changing the Order of Things, Geography, and the Political Imaginary in the Novels of Toni Morrison, whose remarkable poems truly must be heard at his Pen Sound page and can be read variously in Milas, the Langston Hughes Colloquy, Versadelphia, and elsewhere, and by Tracie Morris, who hardly needs introducing to PoemTalk listeners, performance artist, vocalist, scholar of performance studies, page-based poet, teacher, scholar, band leader, improvisationist, whose many books include Hoodoo with Words and Handholding, Five Kinds. There's a sequel to that maybe we'll talk about later. And Hardcore Poems Perform, Poems of Mythos and Place, and I'm holding in my hand a brand new book, which maybe we'll talk about at the end, Human/Nature. Poems, very exciting, and whose Pen Sound page is a treasure trove of powerful performances that swerve and blur and converge and do things with words and sounds. And by Amber Rose Johnson, a recent, and I mean recent, we're still celebrating, we're still hungover from the celebrations, a recent graduate of the doctoral program in English and Africana Studies here at Penn. Yay! A writer, scholar, and cultural worker committed to Black study and experimentation, editor of Colored People Time, a celebrated exhibition catalog from the Institute of Contemporary Art here in Philadelphia at Penn, whose writing can be found in Art Forum, Book Forum, Bomb Literary Magazine, and elsewhere, and who, I'm just ad-libbing, is bound to join the faculty at McGill University in Quebec, Canada. Amber Rose.
Yo.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Al.
It's so exciting. Tracie, you, I don't know, crawled over cut glass, Amtrak glass to get here. It was hard.
It was
really hard.
It took me longer to wait for the train to get here than the actual, how long it takes for me to get here.
Oh.
But that's
well,
all right.
The thing about you is, I talk to, there's many things about you, but there's one thing about you is I talk to people, I say, Tracie Morris is coming just for PoemTalk and then going back. Yeah, well, Tracie says yes. Sorry, we might cut that out. Anyway.
It's already a known. Believe me. Oh, my God.
Yeah. And speaking of known knowns, since 1989, Herm.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
1989. For that Public Enemy song started like that.
It doesn't look like you've been here any longer than 1991, I got to say.
The top of my head says different.
I love the top of your head.
Off the top of your head, you mean, right?
No, the top of my head where there's no hair.
How about if we do a show? You want to do a show?
That's a good idea.
Okay. Or we actually, before we turned on the recording device, Zach and I were looking at each other like, wished we'd gotten some of what was being said as,
blooper reel.
Outtakes, exactly. Okay, today, seriously, we four have gathered to talk about two poems by Owen Dodson. One is called Sorrow is the Only Faithful One, and an elegaic sonnet for Billie Holiday, Finally, Lady, You Are Gone From Us. I think the title was meant to be Finally, Lady, You Are Gone From Us, dedicated for Billie Holiday. Our recordings of these poems come from the Library of Congress to Pen Sound, where on December 13th, 1960, Dodson entered the recording laboratory at Library of Congress, I think, to perform a selection of his poems. And our poems are the 5th and 13th poems Dodson read in his set, respectively. during that recording session. So here now is Owen Dodson performing Sorrow is the Only Faithful One and finally, Lady, You Are Gone From Us.
Sorrow is the only faithful one, the lone companion clinging like a season to its original skin, no matter what the variations. If all the mountains paraded eating the valleys as they went, and the sun were coiffure on the highest peak, sorrow would be there, between the sparkling and the giant laughter of the enemy when the clouds come down to swim. But I am less, unmagic, black. Sorrow clings to me more than to doomsday mountains or erosion scars on a palisade. Sorrow has a song like a leech, crying because the sand's blood is dry, and the stars reflected in the lake are water for all their twinkling and bloodless for all their charm. I have blood and a song. Sorrow is the only faithful one. This is called Finally Lady. You were gone from us. They called her Lady Day. Then they starched you, Billie, in your shroud. Gardenias, orchids, all proclaimed you dead. Musical gangsters, hucksters, feeble friends proud to publicly rejoice and scratch. You had the nerve to wed your psalms of love, how shredded love with taste. The larynx of your Tartar bird they split. They bleeded it. They crossed it with the waists of birds or topsied carrion neon, fit for alley hops. Finally, before they carried you to dirt, nothing was further necessary for shame. They stood the cops before your final hurt. They snitched away relief from final pain. They asked for curses, signatures, for photo looks, approached your bed, and snatched your comic books.
Herm, I'm going to give you the choice. Which poem should we start with?
I think we should start with the Billie Holiday elegy.
Okay. What's the first thing you want to say?
I spent time scanning this poem, and my interpretation coming from scanning it is that it starts out with using a bunch of different metrical patterns. So there are iambs, there are trochees, there are anapaests, there are dactyls. But the last 4 lines of the poem are all iambics. And so I read that as Dodson using this sort of conformity to standard sonnet meter to the disciplining of Billie Holiday's body.
So the meter is replicating, as he says in the first line, the starching
Yes.
that has to occur, partly responsible for her death, he would say, via the preface. Wow, so the iambs are a way of regularizing an already pretty regular Shakespearean sonnet. Tracie Morris, where do we go with that?
Well, I want to say something about the context. It seems like a lot of Dodson's poems, both in the Library of Congress collection and others, negotiate the idea of the decay of the body, the disrespect of the body, and resurrection. It's very much related to notions of the suffering of Christ in our remembering and his anger about the treatment of the body. She is resurrected and she endures. So she endures in memory. And so what Herman is talking about in terms of the lack of constraint in the meter in most of the poems says something about how she refused to be constrained, but also the wildness around her that he is arguing led to her demise because of the bigotry. But it's also this sort of elegaic grace that she had self-comportment in her choices, even her wild choices that were not acknowledged in her death, but that he remembers, and he remembers through anger. He's not offering that kind of positionality of Christ. It's like, well, it's about forgiveness and you sacrifice. It's like, no, it was wrong. And in my righteous indignation, she will continue to live. We will remember how she was disrespected in life and in death.
Amber Rose, hearing Tracie, I looked again at the page and saw how many theys there are. There's a lot of they. So there's an us-them situation going on. Can you say more about that? Who's they?
Yeah, absolutely. The they seems to be those that he's angry with, those who didn't come to her with the level of respect that he felt like she was due. And so in a way, by so constituting the they and you, we don't have an I here. So there's a way that he positions himself sort of right next to Billie Holiday and speaking not necessarily on her behalf, but speaking from the position of someone else who also knows that kind of disrespect, that kind of harm. And so the constant, they stood the cops, they snatched away your curses, they snatched away relief, they asked for curses, is sort of making unapproachable this line between us and them.
Yeah, they stood the cops. I can't get away from that phrase. They stood the cops. So they is a larger subset of people than the cops. This they is not the cops. The cops are part of they. They stood the cops before your final hurt. What does that mean? They snatched away relief. They also snatched away her comic books. So while Herm, the iambics, returns us to the purest form of the Shakespearean sonnet, leading to the couplet at the end, the GG couplet, at the same time, the language gets a little more demotic than it did. Maybe not much more demotic, but asked for curses, signatures for photo looks, approach your bed and snitched your comic books. That's a weird ending. Am I wrong?
Well,
did I overstate that?
If you've read, there are two books. If you've read Billie Holiday's autobiography, which was actually ghostwritten, and you read Fair Griffin's book about Billie Holiday, we know that the cops were, in fact, standing by her bed. She was handcuffed to her bed, and she was actually arrested. So the handcuffs were because she was arrested for drug possession. I'm interested in Dodson's comment about Billie Holiday's husband not being able to be close to her. Louis McKay was a scoundrel. So he's part of the they. She couldn't go on stage one night because he hit her in the back of the head with a telephone. He was highly abusive and manipulative. So one of the things that I read into that us-them is that Dodson wants us to have a relational interaction with Billie Holiday. The they, the musical gangsters and hucksters and feeble friends, those are transactional relationships.
How do we deal with an attempt to replicate the agony of someone who could bend notes like nobody else in a not bend note, traditional, Shakespearean, British, English, high-toned form? Is there an irony, that structural formal irony he's creating by writing a nearly perfect Shakespearean sonnet for someone who would have bent the notes of the form?
Well,
or is that an unfair question?
Well, I think it's an interesting way of thinking about bending, because I'm just considering what Amber Rose is saying about the they, and what I got from your comment, Amber Rose, is this idea of bearing witness. Who is going to bear witness? And what's so fascinating with this poem is those who are unequivocally bearing witness with integrity are not people. They're non-people. So like the gardenias and orchids have this kind of open kind of flowers that kind of look like trumpets. They're clarion calling, right? They proclaim, almost like their horns proclaiming, right? So it's, the Tartar bird, right? The autopsied birds. This relationship between the flowers and the birds here, and I'm just going to see if there's any other nouns that jump out. It's the Psalms of love. It's all of this deep articulation that's not human-based, but is sort of anthropomorphized. It's like the humans fail, right? They fail, but not these. Not these. The flowers don't fail. The birds don't fail. And so this idea of how she's bending the popular culture of comic book, it's not, if you read it superficially, it's kind of like it's silly, but it was her way of finding joyful pleasure in a simple way she was just allowed to be young, because as Farah talks about in that wonderful book, she didn't really have a childhood. She had she was like born an adult, partly because of her great beauty, partly because of the vulnerability of Black women in society.
I'm thinking about form, and it's interesting that you said that it was such an unbendable form, because although, I mean, certainly there's there's a rhyme scheme, but the rhyme doesn't quite announce itself very clearly. In either the reading of it, you really have to find that meter, or in his reading, it doesn't quite announce
Not in
itself.
his reading,
so
for sure, yeah.
We can sit back and analyze and say there is this structured form, this very historical form, but in his occupation of it, and then our occupation of it as readers, and her occupation of it as he's summoning her spirit, it's almost on a slant. And I think that's what she also did in her music so beautifully. She took these very particular moves, but then presented them to us in such a way that we might almost miss the richness of what she's doing. And that's why she was so magical as a performer. Mm.
I want to enter into the record what Hilton Als remembers Owen Dodson saying about meeting Billie Holiday. This would be Dodson meeting Billie Holiday years before. And then Hilton and Owen Dodson had a relationship that I will leave it to our listeners to read about, because it's complicated. It's a complicated relationship. It was a sexual relationship of a much younger person, Hilton. And it's in the book, The Women, and Owen Dodson is one of the women. So this is Owen talking to the young Hilton, and Hilton's remembering it. Child, I met Billie Holiday through my boyfriend Carl Priebe in the 40s. She was appearing in a club in New York on 52nd Street. I came up from Washington to see Carl. He was working, and he suggested I come along to meet her. Child, she was in this awful dressing room, smaller than my small bathroom. She called me Teach. So Owen was by that point, I guess, the chair of the drama department at Howard, right? Her dress was hiked up around her waist. She was fanning her P-word with a fan. She said, looking straight at me, fanning her P-word, Teach, it's so goddamn hot in here. That's the scene that Dodson remembers. That's not at all like this. You know, this is the point of view of some people. His use of the traditional form kind of undermines what he's trying to say because he's so devoted to those forms. The starching that is done to Billie, you don't get in that story he's telling the young Hilton, but I think you get it a little in the use of the sonnet.
Well, that's a really radical, scene.
The scene where he meets her in the dressing room. Yeah.
I mean, because this is a eulogy, Al, so it's kind of like awkward.
You're not supposed to talk about that scene there, obviously.
Well, I think it's a queer scene. And she just refused to not be her full self around anybody. But I think the context is not transgression for its own sake, but the search for freedom on her own terms. In the story that you just recited and the elegy, she refuses not to be free. And that's what the comic book at the end is. And that's what that presentation is. It's very important to me that scene is not seen as either pornographic or coarse. It's hot, and she's not going to cross her legs and bear that bull crap. It's boiling, and she's basically in a closet. And she's like, guess what I'm not doing? Acting like the closet's okay. So that's what that scene means to me.
But is this poem acting like the closet's okay?
Well, it's two people who are endorsing a queer moment and refusing to apologize for it. And that's why it's an intimate conversation between Hilton and Mr. Dodson. But it's also a queer intimacy between two people who are not sexually interested in each other, Billie Holiday and Owen Dodson. And it has to be framed as freedom, because too often Billie Holiday is reduced to a woman of ill repute who didn't know how to act, who could pass and had a beautiful voice. She was black all the way, like turtles all the way down. She's black all the way down. She's beautiful all the way down. And she was searching to be free in a world that continued to try to enslave her all the way down.
Well, it's interesting because I saw this play about Billie Holiday called Billie Holiday at the Emerson Bar and Grill.
I saw that one.
A couple weeks ago. And it's really interesting to think about the play in relationship to the poem, because the play is literally about this Billie Holiday who's a shadow of herself. And so what I love about the All's passage is that she's in this space where she's clearly not being honored for the genius that she is, and yet she still gives Dodson his respect by calling him Teach.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So even if the people that she's working for aren't treating her respect, she treats him with respect, which means that she has a sense of decorum that the people she's working for do not.
I love, I'm so grateful for this, for how y'all are reading this scene, for the exact reason that you said, Tracie, that could be misread. But what's important is that she is saying, I'm going to put respect where respect is due, and I'm not going to acknowledge or take or make myself smaller given the context that I've been placed in. I'm going to find comfort for myself. I'm going to produce comfort for myself, but also to allow Dodson to see that is a welcoming into intimacy in relation that may be similar to the relation that Dr. Beavers is telling us that he wants us to feel in this poem. And so there could be a way that we could say, well, putting it in a sonnet is forcing others to respect. No, y'all are going to read her in this very respectful sonnet.
So the sonnet is an expression of respect.
Yes. And then, but what happens within that sonnet, there's this cloak of respect, and then there's some other deeper working that's happening in it. But you have to first confront that cloak of respect that he's putting on with
One
form.
more thing from Hilton, then I'll put the book away. But this is the part of the book about Owen Dodson. Hilton says, although many, many people knew what Owen's intellectual and aesthetic tastes were, they never discussed the absence of those tastes from his written work, where he forfeited his vision for the sake of Negro respectability.
Right. And that's what I was going to say is the distinction that I got from Amber Rose's comment, respect versus respectability.
Right.
Billie Holiday's not interested in the respectability.
Right.
She knows that it's bullcrap artifice,
Right.
and it has nothing to do with why she's so compelling. Mm-hmm. But she is respectful of herself, of her agency, and certainly of Owen Dodson at that moment. So there's another thing that I think is interesting about this, the second thing that you read, how Owen Dodson is framing the performative, right, and performativity. You have this presentation of this queer moment, right, that is not performing for someone who is preparing to perform something else on stage, right? So this is the real her not performing except her authentic self and this queered moment. That's not the same as the person on stage who is being imposed upon with certain artifices of respectability that are also dovetail with developing early and also colorism. She's not playing tragic. So it's just so interesting because Owen Dodson has a lot of that so-called respectability because of his love of conventional theater and how that all dovetails in, and how the sonnet is Shakespearean sonnet because he's a Shakespearean scholar of acting and presenter of Shakespearean acting. So it's all kind of in there, but neither of them, I think, is doing it to be respectable for the they.
Well, the interesting thing going off that is that Dodson is at Howard, which could be tyrannical in its treatment of faculty if they veered away from respectability. Now, Billie Holiday, on the other hand, respecting her audience is part of her DNA. She started her career singing in speakeasies where she had to go to each table and sing the song to each table because they couldn't have microphones because the police would raid the place if people could hear it out on the street. So she's kind of come up with this sonic discipline.
Oh, that's interesting.
That I think Dodson is very much aware of, but it's also the thing that gets commodified and which he then talks about in the poem as this thing that people just pile trash on top of, along with the indignity of her being arrested while she's in bed ill, right? But we don't talk about addiction in the 1950s. We don't talk about it as an illness. It's a crime. And so she can't be recovered from that. Even the autobiography can't recover her from that. And so when you think about Psalms of, I mean, what I love that fifth line, your Psalms of love, of shredded love. So he amplifies it, right? So in musical terms, of shredded love is a grace note, or even a ghost note. You don't have to play it. Psalms of love works perfectly fine, but when you put shredded love on top of that, he takes us to the sort of core of her art.
Herm, the nerve is merging those two things. That's the nerve. Mm-hmm. You have the nerve to do it with taste.
Right.
And that's Owen Dodson affirming.
Well, there's another interesting thing I hear what you both are saying is this choice by Dodson to say bleeded or bleeded, bleeded instead of bled, right? It adds another, it's another syllable, but it's also so-called grammatically incorrect. Like there's something that's like improper that he's infusing this thing with that goes against the respectability. And just your comment about Howard's so interesting too, Herman, because of course it's also about fear. This absolute fear. If you step a toe out of line and aren't respectable Negroes, then your funding will be taken away.
Right.
Everything will be taken away.
Right.
I mean, we have another poem to talk about, but we could, if we were only talking about this poem, we could spend a half hour talking about the move from Washington from Howard to 52nd Street, which is what in later years Dodson did. He moved to New York, which is when Hilton met him. But the time he met him that he's recalling in that story that he told Hilton was he wanted to see his boyfriend in New York, so he went from Washington to 52nd Street, and that's a journey. Mm-hmm. And that's what you guys are talking about. Mm-hmm. So interesting. Mm-hmm. Ambrose, we're going to switch to the other poem, but I want to give you a chance to say one more thing about this last one.
I'm still lingering with the nerve. That's very much a particular colloquialism. You had the nerve to do this the right way. But I'm also thinking about to have that particular kind of nerve under these seemingly impossible situations, which is to say you not just had the nerve to do it, but you did it with integrity and with nuance and attention to detail. And so he too, that's another moment where he's recognizing the freedom that she made, that she carved out, that she demanded, that she would settle for nothing less than that quality in her work and in her living when and where she could. Mm.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next poem, and I'm just going to ask Zach to play the first couple of lines to get it back in our heads, and then maybe Herm, you'll start with saying anything.
Sorrow is the only faithful one, the lone companion clinging like a season to its original skin, no matter what the variations. If all the mountains paraded eating the valleys as they went, and the sun were coiffure on the highest peak, sorrow would be there, between the sparkling and the giant laughter of the enemy, when the clouds come down to swim.
First off, this is unrhymed tercets, which is an interesting contrast to the sonnet. The second thing is that by the time we get to the second stanza...
What is that concede? I still don't get it.
It's conditional and it's scalar. So in terms of scale, if all the mountains paraded, eating the valleys as they went. So just before I walked over, I was thinking about there's this sort of carnivorous landscape, and the sun wore a coiffure. So the sun wore a hairdo. Mm-hmm. So part of what the poem is getting at is that one, it's a purely metaphorical poem and observational. The poem is going to shift by that fourth stanza to something else, to a different agenda. But overall, the poem drives toward the social, but that's not where it starts.
Tracie, you want to take it from there?
Oh my goodness, this poem is like, it's so much going on with him.
I know.
I can't even.
He's locating sorrow or depression in what could have been the valley, would have been the cliche is the valley between the peaks, but the peaks are actually devouring the other peaks to create a different geology. So it's hard to find out where depression is, and depression is related to blackness at some point. So this is all hard.
Yeah, it's his contrasts are just insane. They're just unbelievable. So when Amber Rose was commenting about the nerve, I was thinking about, but he on the same line, he has the word scratch. It's like I can barely hold on when I'm reading this. Clinging like a season to its original skin. Everything is so sticky and tactile and too much. And he's so freaking brilliant. But I am less unmagic black. It's like that old black magic. I'm the opposite of that. But it's also the magical Negro. I'm the opposite of that. I'm the opposite of anything that says that it's okay for me to be sorrowful because I'm not 100% human anyway. That's what the point is. And that's part of the reason why I think the coiffure is in there. Because it's like, it's an embellishment on a particular human affect. He's asserting his humanity. But there's something I want to say about how slick his form is here that is just driving me cuckoo bananas, right? If you look at the position of each line, where they are in each tercet, they make these really compelling poems. It's like to its original skin, no matter what the variations, and the sun were a coiffure on the highest peak of the enemy when the clouds came down to swim, or erosion scars on a palisade, and the stars reflected in the lake. I have blood and a song. Sorrow is the only faithful one. I'm like, I'm dead. I'm done. Yeah. I'm going to bed and taking a nap. I mean, it's so visceral.
Every time we try to locate sorrow in this poem, it becomes hard. But, and Ambrose, you were going to say something else because you were nodding at me, but here I go again asking a question which you can either answer or ignore. I'm trying to figure out where sorrow would be there between. So between suggests, finally, that some parts of this conceit, forms a middle space, and something is between those two things. So I, as a reader, kind of a regular reader, I'm trying to figure it out. Is it between the peaks and valleys, or is the between just the valleys? Sorrow would be there. Sorrow is the only thing we can predict. Sorrow is our buddy. Sorrow is always there, but where is the question?
Okay, here's my hot take on that, which is that there isn't really a between. The between maybe is only in the variations. And I'm saying that because I'm thinking about these mountains eating up the valleys and clinging like a season, which seasons don't actually cling. They cling for a period, but then they change. They're in these variations. So it's almost like as soon as you get going, the ground underneath you is being eaten up. As soon as the season appears,
and this is a
the
metaphor
season is
for
changing.
What?
And so the mountains are eating up the valleys, right? And so there isn't really any in between because what comes before and what comes after is already being eaten up. So sorrow being the constant that's where you get the changing same, right? Where the only thing that's the same is the constant kind of turning over. That's where sorrow is.
Well, reading literally, which we're generally not, we don't do that, but certainly after Tracie performed the poems through the first lines, the second lines, and the third line for not reading anything literally, but whatever. Sorrow would be there between, on one hand, the sparkling, so I guess sparkling is a noun there, the sparkling, and on the other hand, the giant laughter of the enemy when the clouds came down to swim.
Well,
There's no between.
To go off of what Amber Rose was saying, if
That's
you look
right,
at
there's
the
no
last,
between.
look at the last two stanzas, and the last line of the next to last, and the stars reflected in the lake are water for all their twinkling and bloodness for all their charm. Well, what are stars but light that reaches us centuries after the fact? So it's false. And water for all their twinkling are water for all their twinkling. So it's a double illusion, right? It's so the light is the first illusion because it's not light that's happening at that moment. It's coming to us. And the second illusion is the stars reflected in the water. But look at how it ends. I have blood and a song. So he's flesh and blood in the midst of all of this inauthentic systems of representation.
Which he calls charm.
Right.
Which is a negative, I guess.
Right. But it seduces us.
Right.
And so when you think about sorrow, your choice of these two poems, Al, I think is really prescient because you can't get Billie Holiday without sorrow, because what she's going to do, the nerve that she has in singing Psalms of Love about shredded love, is that she takes it and infuses it with the blues. So the second poem,
she has blood and a song.
Right.
And the song here, it's a metapoetic moment. The song is this thing.
Right.
And as much as I really admire what's going on in the other poem, this is more like the bloodful song of Billie Holiday than the sonnet. But he's contradicting what the speaker is laying out there. Contradicting. He's turning toward himself, the speaker is, and saying, I have blood and a song. If I were to follow this giant geological metaphor, it would be charming and bloodless. But I, on the other hand, and it's a County Cullen kind of paradox, right? You know, like, oh my gosh, I'm a poet. I don't have much of a choice here. I'm a poet and I'm black, and this is what I've got. So all this other stuff is performative.
Right.
Well, this, I keep going back to what Amber Rose is saying about there is no between. I agree with you. If there's no valley and the mountains are parading with no valley because they're too close to each other, then all you have is these little peaks, and the sun is on top of the peakiest of those peaks. But you don't actually need a valley to have a mountain. You need peaks to have a mountain, right? So if there's that disappearing, then sorrow becomes this sort of it becomes this odd aspirational thing because it is trustworthy, because the living, the flesh and blood have sorrow, capable of sorrow, So because it's it's like if there's no between, why are they parading? Like parading is not doleful, right? So there's a kind of a trust with sorrow, and that's in contrast to the unpredictability of how what clings to black skin, right? So that's why I think that Amber Rose is on target with saying that there is no between, because that's not actually required for this metaphor. Mm-hmm. So what is actually the thing that's needed? And so it's saying that sorrow's needed, and maybe that's, like you were saying, Herman, why these were such good selections by Al, because that's how we hear Billie Holiday.
So how does blackness come in? But I am less unmagic, black, sorrow clings to me more than to doomsday mountains. It's almost as if he's saying, well, that big, giant, mountainous conceit of the first part of this poem, my sorrow is even bigger than that. I think that's what he's saying. Well,
that's what I meant by the poem drives toward the social. So that those second and third stanzas, they're one sentence. So this poem has a very interesting system of the sentence, because stanzas 1 and 4 are one sentence. Stanzas 2 and 3 and 5 and 6 they're the sentence. So he's enjamming across the stanza break. And that's how we get a full sentence. So if you were to write this poem out, as sentences, it would take on a very interesting form. But if all the mountains paraded, right? So it's conditional. But he needs that because, to Tracie's point, he needs to be able to give us a sense of the scale of sorrow, which is deep and wide and irrepressible and constant. And so, what I read as we get to the end of the poem is that humans turn to illusion as a way to shake off their sorrow, and that's a losing proposition.
There's one other thing to go to your point, Al. I am less unmagic black. Sorrow clings to me more than to doomsday mountains, because the black that clings to mountains is shadow, and that's temporary. Mm-hmm. But unmagically, black clings to me not in some mystical way. It clings to me in a way that is more like a leech. Not the blackness of itself, but that what attaches itself to my blackness that drains me. And that's not like the etiolation or the shadow of the mountain.
I want to add the word irreducible to the words that we've thrown out, that there's something about sorrow and blackness or black, this unmagic black, that is irreducible. There is nothing that comes after it. It cannot be shaken off. It will not pass with shadow or season.
That's nice.
There's something irreducible. And thinking about his performance, when he gets to this fourth and fifth stanza, there's a power that comes behind his voice that speaks of that irreducibility, that he's occupying it, perhaps not triumphantly, but in its unmoving, factual nature.
Zach, I wonder if we could ask you to play where our playing of it a few minutes ago left off, starting with the second half of the poem, But I Am Less. This is the moment Amber Rose is talking about.
But I am less unmagic black. Sorrow clings to me more than to doomsday mountains or erosion scars on a palisade. Sorrow has a song like a leech, crying because the sand's blood is dry, and the stars reflected in the lake are water for all their twinkling and bloodless for all their charm. I have blood and a song. Sorrow is the only faithful one.
What are you hearing?
The resolution in the D on blood. I could stay right there.
Tracie, what kind of voice is this?
Well, it's one that's very well trained. It's so interesting because, we have to think about, like, he's a professor of drama. He's a poet as a professor of drama at a particular time, right? It's at the nexus of a particular type of acting tradition in the United States that has infused and revolutionized American acting with people like Ira Aldridge, as you know, whom I've been researching for a long time.
Yeah, you have. Yeah.
But it's also at the intersection of method acting, right? Method acting is beginning to emerge. And I think that you're hearing the conversation of both of those elements in his voice, in his articulation. And then he's adding, like, black affect of everyday life on top of all of those things. It's a very sonorous, self-aware vocal presentation that becomes dramatic acting of the poem. And it's very clearly Shakespearean, but with these other kind of elements of pathos that are being influenced by method acting and black social change, the drives of social change that Herman was talking about too. So it's really fascinating how he's combining all of these things. And I just want to say something sneaky about that. Another person who he influenced, which you can also find in Library of Congress archives, who has this kind of grounded articulation that Amber Rose was talking about, is Lucille Clifton. There's a conversation between him and Lucille Clifton, and she mentions when the person says, oh, you have this really incredible way of delivering the line. She said, yeah, I learned from this guy named Owen Dodson.
So it's interesting that you say that because both Toni Morrison and Lucille Clifton studied with Dodson.
Right. And if you
At Howard.
At Howard.
And if you hear Lucille Clifton and Owen Dodson in the same, you're like, yeah,
So you can learn Afro-Shakespearean in college from a teacher. I used Afro-Shakespearean as a word that you used years ago in a different context. That's what this is.
Yeah.
And you can learn that. You can learn it from community, obviously, but you can also learn it by going to the drama department at Howard at a certain time.
Well, in music,
Right.
this is like Ella Fitzgerald, whose enunciation was perfect. You compare her to Dinah Washington, who's a little bit later. Enunciation is not as important to Dinah Washington as it is to Ella Fitzgerald. And so in that sense, that last part of the poem, it is sonorous. It is perfect enunciation. And it also says, interestingly enough, if we put this in a sort of periodic sense, he's too young for the Harlem Renaissance. He's too early for the Black Arts Movement, and they wouldn't have accepted him anyway because he's too Western. He's too Western. His syntax is too Western.
He's using traditional form.
Right, and he's using traditional forms. And so the other thing about the voice is that talk about peaks. There are peaks and valleys in how he speaks. The Black Arts Movement is going to become this sort of flat monotone. When I think about the stuff that Barack is doing, or David Henderson maybe, it's going to become this sort of hard drive. But they can't afford to. I mean, it's their bad interpretation of bebop saxophone on some level. They can't put variation in it because to do that is to relent and allow the Western aesthetic to creep in. He's not burdened by that.
I think that the Black Arts Movement, every group has its thing.
Right.
And I think they had a different kind of cadence.
Absolutely.
That they were trying to do something. They did some interesting stuff with punctuation that was different too, right?
Right.
But I agree with you that there was a kind of self-awareness about what Dodson's doing. But I'm so glad that you mentioned this distinction with Ella Fitzgerald, because a lot of his poems that we saw in this transcript are about Jesus, and the other one with Lucille Clifton. But it's also about war and the World War II people. And I think there's a kind of light on Black culture and Black people during the two great wars, I'm putting great quotes, right, that put a lens on, and this sort of unifying, this desire to unify the country around these wars, that gave Black people a different kind of lens in the popular cultural imagination of America. And that's where some of that articulation comes from. It's like, we're not doing minstrelsy, we're not doing this, we're doing something that's omni-American, to borrow a Ishmael Reed term, right? And that self-awareness was not as prevalent the more that you moved away from World War II, right? So Ella Fitzgerald had it, and the Andrews sisters and all these other people had it. But then it started to move away because we realized that some of those things that people said that we were supposed to be about didn't actually turn out to be about it in 1919, obviously, and after World War II.
So this is a World War II generation person who has the Black soldiers' experience.
Right.
So someone like Baraka, that was Korea era. And his reaction was totally different. This is the point you're making. Dodson is a World War II Black poet whose R-lessness, the internal R, it's the high Howard, certain part of New York City, trained R-lessness, not your Brooklyn R-lessness. It's totally different, right? So I loved when you said coiffure. How did you say it? Well, I didn't want you to perform that, but
my bad French.
But no, but Owen Dodson's pronunciation of that is he's R-less and making a point about generation. I think so. Ambrose, what are you thinking about by now?
I don't have. I'm listening and learning right now from these two.
Yeah, these two are amazing.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about the way that history shows up in the voice, and that Tracie's first comment was that voice is well trained, and I think sometimes with Black poets in particular, we confuse training with something less than that, and that could happen for both
pretension.
maybe not pretension, maybe something
Charm.
maybe something like style without respect for what style really
Right.
is.
Okay.
And so I just appreciate that we're talking about the kind of formal training and about legacy and about relation of training amongst many folks, right? And how all of that is influenced so much so that we can say, oh, I can hear both the relationship between these folks and the larger cultural history that they're tapping into in the pronunciation of a single word.
Yeah.
Tracie, you were talking about bleated. A colloquialism, at least in my community I grew up in, we used to say cold-blooded, but if you wanted to do a variation on it, you'd say, damn, that was cold-bleeded.
Is that a Cleveland
I'm gonna have to
thing?
use
That's a
that
Cleveland
one.
thing. That's a Cleveland thing.
Cold bleeded.
Cold bleeded.
Yeah,
that's ice cold.
That's Cleveland.
cold.
'Cause that didn't make it over to the east, but now it's on the east with you,
Now,
Herman.
too late, Herm. You messed us up. Okay, final thoughts, everybody, on either the poems or on Owen Dodson. If you want to add to your final thoughts, just why Dodson matters, I mean, it's this is important stuff. Not a lot of people know about it. Herm, you got one?
Yeah. So he actually says it in the introduction to the reading. He didn't send out his poems regularly. He spent more time in rehearsals for plays than he did. Clearly he was prolific, but he didn't do the things that poets do, which is to get their work out there. I mean, I identify with that because I spend so much time on the scholarly side. I don't send my work out either. People ask me for it, and I send it.
And you also spend some time with drama, don't you?
Yes. And so the thing about him is that I'm glad that we did this because he's unsung, and he deserves his due. The next time I teach my poetry class, which will probably be when I come back from leave, we're gonna give Owen Dodson some his props because. He's a crafts. His attention to craft and his ability to show that attention to craft without sacrificing his social consciousness is amazing.
Maybe time for a new edition of Selected. I don't think there's anything in print. I don't know that for sure, but I think that's the case. Tracie Morris, final thought.
Yeah. I'm so glad to know more about him. He's
right up your alley.
Yeah, so many of the boxes, but he's such a great writer. He's such a fine writer, and I think it's kind of like it makes me think of Nat King Cole. Like he's a beautiful person. And he was a beautiful singer, but he was a great piano player. He's like a giant of jazz piano.
Yes.
But because he was such a great singer and he was so beautiful, he kind of became like a spokesmodel for a certain kind of, but it's like, there's kind of like people say, you kind of wish he'd like focused on the piano because he's such a great piano.
Right.
And I love this guy.
I was just having this conversation.
Really?
About Nat King Cole as a piano player.
So Owen Dodson is like this beautiful singer. And he's like the Hilton Owls and Billie Holiday and the stories. But I'm just like, his poetry is so fine. I kind of selfishly wish he had written more books and done less acting, even though he helped Lucille Clifton. And so I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to know more about this person. But I'm so selfishly there's two sides of me that I'm like, yeah, I know you got the acting thing, but you're freaking writing. There's a lot of great actors, but there's not as many writers that are as great as he is. I'm sorry.
There's probably a racial sociology having to do with staying with the chairmanship of the drama department at Howard, then to moving over to the poetry stuff, which would have been the English department. I'm not sure how that went, and I'm not sure what his queerness had to do with his position within the academy.
Right.
I'm not sure. I don't know enough about it. But
I'm just being selfish.
my guess is there are all kinds of reasons why that was his lane. Amber Rose, what are your final thoughts?
My final thought is going back to a phrase that Tracie said, bearing witness. I'm thinking about how we are bearing witness to Dodson and the care with which we are trying to do that, the method of care with which we are bringing to our witnessing, and also the method of care that he is bringing to witnessing Billie Holiday. I'm thinking about Holiday witnessing Dodson also as teach, like just the kind of seeing, how you see someone and how you capture that seeing and make that seeing available to others is deeply important work. And we're able to do that in this style of close reading poetry. And I think the best of Black study is also trying to do that in various ways.
Love that meta comment. Thank you. My final thought, there are two points I want to make, small ones, about the sonnet. The use of the word finally in the title. Finally, lady, you were gone from us. The implication being I could have written a pre-elegy about you 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago. There's a finality, but there's also this has been in our minds for a while. I think it's a powerful word. And the second point I want to make is about the only not perfect rhyme in the sonnet, which rhymes shame and pain. It's the only near rhyme. Otherwise, so that would be in the EF quatrain, the F in the, sorry, I'm getting my numbers right. It's the Fs that are a little off. And I indicated that by putting a little parentheses around my F. And of course, in a Dickinsonian way, although she wasn't a sonnet writer, in a Dickinsonian way, the word that doesn't rhyme, the slant rhyme, has to be on pain. It causes pain. And it's just another example of the marvelousness of the attention to rhyming. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of gathering paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow Dickinsonian hands to gather something poetically good that's going on in the poetry world or the music world or the film world or the theater world, whatever world you've got going. Who's got one?
I got one that I haven't read yet, but I'm very intrigued by.
Oh, that's good.
Based on our conversation.
That counts.
I ran into this really interesting, lovely scholar named Duncan Yoon at a conference, and he has a new book out. He's at NYU, called China in 20th and 21st Century African Literature. And I'm like, that's right.
That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, all of the conversations that we've been having about how people reframe Blackness, but also reframe notions of the Western tradition. This is like a whole different take on framing and reframing. So I'm really interested. It's coming out of Cambridge University Press, and it's a lot of theory and literary studies. But I'm excited to check that book out. China in 20th and 21st Century African Literature.
Great suggestion.
By Duncan Yoon.
Herm wrote it down. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So my moment of gathering paradise, I was asked to be the judge of the Cornelius Eady Toy Darracott chapbook contest. And the book that I chose as the prize winner is Meredith Noka's I Could Never Be Your Woman. It is fabulous. It's relentless. That's because I had to write the introduction. That's what I said about it in the introduction. It's fabulous. She writes in forms, but in the end, it's a book about a persona being in an abusive relationship and all the ways the persona thinks their way out of that, and it is going to make a huge splash. There were other manuscripts that were worthy of being chosen. I chose Noka's book because I just think she's going to be a bright star quickly and for a long time.
Great recommendation. Thank you. Say the name again.
Meredith Noka. Well, and Noka, because she's Nigerian.
Fabulous.
And the name of the book again?
If I Could Never Be Your Woman.
Great. Thanks for doing, yet again, and this would be true of all three of you, all that stuff that people ask you to do. How many books did you have to read?
It came down to probably about 30.
Yeah, so it's a lot of work, and this is important service. I'll just say that, in a recording so people can hear it and say yes more often. Amber Rose, you're about to begin a career of yes.
I know. I'm like, wow.
What are you in for?
Have
you sure you want to do this?
To be on.
Yay.
My Gathering Paradise recommendation is, the only book I want to be reading right now, which is Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes.
I knew you were going to do Christina Sharp.
Yeah, how could I not?
Yeah.
Of course.
We've been talking about this.
Yes, but thinking about that work, and especially because what Dodson does in this poem for Billie Holiday, I think Christina is doing in some similar ways. And I just want to read this one line Jenna Wortham writes, talking about Ordinary Notes. She says, "If there's an argument at the center of Ordinary Notes, it's that attentiveness and imagination are powerful restorative agents capable of reconstituting what has been broken down and targeted for obliteration." And I think that poem did something similar.
Wow. This is good. Okay, I have one. I don't think it's going to be... You'll see what's going to happen in a second. It's Tracie Morris is my paradise. The book is Human Nature Poems, human/nature poems. And I have my copy. Tracie Morris gave me a copy. And I have chosen a poem. So I'm going to ask Tracie to read it. And the poem is very... among other things, very useful for people trying to understand the relationship between post-war black modernism, in this case Ralph Ellison, and pre-war poetic modernism, in this case Ezra Pound's Station at the Metro. The poem is called Invisible Man on a Station in the Metro. Tracie, are you okay reading this?
I've been put on the spot by you more than once, Al.
And you're okay.
Okay.
You're still saying yes.
Invisible Man on a Station in the Metro for Al Filreis, putting me on the spot for PoemTalk.
Okay.
I'm Spectre between underground stations. I used to know them a little, and they knew me. I was eating with them sometimes. We would exchange phrases. One day, myself began making cameos. It happened while I was eating grits, and then once again in a public space, I felt disembodies because I had been a shell of my origin for such a long time. It felt like gelatin in the beginning. I don't eat that stuff, cloven hooves. But this is how it seemed at first. It began to expand like a marshmallow. It was good, but it felt overly sweet. I began to ask myself, is this a guilty pleasure? One day, it happened. I wasn't just a resident. It was me, filling up cubby holes in my bones, and I did not feel bloated. I was doing so much better before. I had friends I could gab to about clothes and political goings-on, anything that didn't require commitment. I began to say less, telling more. I was not the hydrogen everybody says I am now. Truth is, I began to thin out. To them, churn and translucent, more corporeal because they noticed less real because my guts began to show in high relief. Nobody wanted to see that. I saw they began to move slower, still a life. Sure, they were picnicking between the openings of the tracks at Grand Central. Yes, they had wicker basket sandwiches with some meat and red drinks and chips. I wanted to sit with some of them, especially exotic-looking types, touring. When I tried to rest for a moment, they would not hear me say hello. They saw condensation on the can, soothing sounds of my throat, and they clinked their glasses. I even moved on to strangers I barely knew, crossed some invisible line, protocol, and they wouldn't hear me or speak. Now, this hurt me. I could understand taking sides, but I faced these people frontways, and there was no side to take. I move on between the numbers, glance at the board, sit by myself, unpack, look at my feet, hoping they still on the ground, withdraw, oh, pen. I got to get this down. That's for Jordan Neely, I just realized.
Oh, wow.
That's him.
That's just amazing.
That's an understatement. I'm having an out-of-the-body experience.
The book is just out, right?
Yeah.
Who published it?
Litmus Press.
Litmus Press. Everybody needs to go out and get that book. Well, that's all the doomsday mountains we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, Penn Sound, and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks to my guests, Tracie Morris, Herman Beavers, and Amber Rose Johnson, with a shout-out to Raymond Maxwell, Ray, in Washington, D.C., for his commitment to the study of Black sonnet writers and for his co-curatorship of this episode. And thanks also to Poem Talk's director and engineer today, Zach Gardner, and to, Zach, and to Poem Talk's editor, the same amazing Zach Gardner. To consult all 192 episodes of Poem Talk dating back to 2007, please go to poemtalk.org. We post the audio recording of each episode, of course, but also program notes, photographs of the Poem Talkers, relevant links to Penn Sound and elsewhere, sometimes a video of the session. Poem Talk is also available through most podcast apps and sites, so check us out and subscribe and leave us a review. Next time on Poem Talk, I'll be talking with Eric Shoemaker visiting us from Chicago, Michelle Taransky, and Patty McCarthy about a poem about her readers by Ariana Reines. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you join us for that or another episode of Poem Talk.